She had built her life carefully, like someone arranging furniture in a small room so nothing could fall or block the door. Every choice she made was quiet and deliberate. She woke up at the same time every morning, left her apartment before the streets became crowded, and returned before the noise of the evening took over. To anyone watching from the outside, her life looked simple and uneventful. That was exactly how she wanted it. She lived alone in a modest place where nothing stood out. The walls were clean but plain, decorated with a few photos that carried more meaning than beauty. Her phone rarely rang, and when it did, she answered only when she felt prepared. She believed peace came from control, and control came from staying small. Experience had taught her that too much attention often invited trouble. At work, she kept to herself. She did her job well, rarely made mistakes, and never asked for more than what was required. Her coworkers described her as polite but distant. Some thought she was shy, others assumed she was simply private. None of them knew that every word she spoke was measured, every smile practiced in restraint. She wasn't afraid of people. She was afraid of unpredictability. There had been a time when she trusted easily. Years ago, she believed that honesty protected people, and that kindness was always returned. That belief didn't survive long. A moment she rarely allowed herself to remember had changed everything. It wasn't loud or violent. It didn't leave bruises. But it taught her that safety could disappear suddenly, without warning, sometimes with a smile. Since then, she had trained herself to watch. Not in an obvious way, but quietly. She noticed tone shifts, body language, pauses in conversation. She learned that silence often said more than words. She trusted patterns instead of promises. If something felt slightly off, she stepped back even if she couldn't explain why. Her evenings followed a routine she found comforting. After work, she stopped by the same small store where the cashier recognized her, but never pushed for conversation. She bought the same items each week, avoided peak hours, and paid quickly. At home, she cooked simple meals, usually enough for one night and the next day's lunch. While eating, she listened to the radio instead of watching TV. Voices felt less intrusive than images. She slept with her phone beside her, volume low, but notifications on. The doors were checked twice before bed. These habits were not born from panic. They were built from repetition. She didn't feel anxious. She felt prepared. That sense of readiness allowed her to rest. There was one place where she felt almost completely at ease. Her job, not because it mattered deeply to her, but because it followed rules, systems, predictability. People came and went, but procedures stayed the same. Authority was clearly defined. That structure gave her comfort. Power, she believed, was controlled there. On the morning everything began to change, nothing felt unusual at first. The air was cool, the sky pale. She followed her routine without rush. At work, she logged in, reviewed her tasks, and settled into the rhythm she knew so well. Conversations floated around her, familiar and harmless. The building felt the way it always did. Then she noticed something small. There was movement where there usually wasn't any. A brief pause in chatter, a shift in posture. People straightened without realizing it. Someone lowered their voice mid-sentence. Even before she turned her head, she felt a change in the room's balance. Like when the air pressure drops before a storm. She glanced up carefully. The door had opened, and someone she had never seen before stood just inside. The person didn't rush or hesitate. They entered with calm certainty, as if the space already belonged to them. Others reacted instantly, some smiling, some nodding, others stepping aside. No introduction was needed to explain their importance. It was obvious. She told herself to look back at her screen. Not everything required attention, but something made her pause. The way conversations adjusted themselves around this presence. The way authority settled invisibly, but heavily. She watched just long enough to notice the eyes. They scanned the room slowly. Not searching, measuring. When those eyes passed over her, they didn't linger. But she felt something tighten in her chest anyway. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition. Power didn't announce itself loudly here. It walked calmly, assuming cooperation. The person spoke to someone near the front. The words were polite, even pleasant, but carried weight. Instructions, lightly delivered. People responded immediately. Systems shifted. She returned to her work, but her focus wavered. Her fingers moved out of habit, but her mind replayed the moment over and over. She couldn't explain why the presence unsettled her. Nothing inappropriate had happened. No attention had been directed at her. Yet her sense of safety had thinned. Like glass tapped too firmly, she reminded herself she was overthinking. She had a tendency to do that. Past experiences had trained her to see warning signs too early, sometimes where none existed. She took a slow breath and forced her shoulders to relax. But as the day continued, the atmosphere felt altered. Meetings were called unexpectedly. Schedules changed without notice. People became more careful with their words. She overheard whispers, vague references to long-term plans and restructuring. She didn't ask questions. Questions made people visible. By midday, she felt tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. The kind of exhaustion that comes from staying alert too long. Still, she told no one. Silence had protected her before. It would do so again. When her shift ended, she left promptly. Outside, the air felt heavier than it had that morning. She walked home as usual, following familiar streets, but her steps were quicker. Inside her apartment, she locked the door and leaned against it briefly. Exhaling slower than she had breathed all day. Nothing had gone wrong, she told herself. Nothing at all yet. As she prepared dinner that night, she caught herself listening harder to the sounds beyond her walls. She checked her phone more often. When she finally lay down to sleep, her mind replayed the door opening again, and again the calm entrance. The quiet authority, the instant shift in the room. For years, she had believed she was safe because she stayed unnoticed. Because she avoided conflict? Because she understood the rules? She didn't yet realize that safety can disappear, not when chaos arrives. But when power quietly decides to pay attention, the next morning, she woke earlier than usual, not because an alarm rang, but because her mind refused to stay quiet. For a few seconds, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had pulled her out of sleep. Nothing had happened, she reminded herself. No call, no message, no dream. Still, her chest felt tight, as if she had been running. She followed her routine anyway. Shower, simple clothes. Hair tied back the same way as always. Routine had always been her shield. If she kept everything the same, the world usually did the same in return. On her way to work, she noticed small things she normally ignored. A security vehicle parked near the entrance. A group of coworkers gathered quietly instead of laughing like they usually did. No one looked worried exactly, just alert, as if everyone had been reminded that they were being watched. Inside, the building felt different. Not loud, not tense, just aware of itself. She took her seat and logged in. But before she could begin, a message appeared on her screen. A brief notice about updated procedures. Mandatory attendance. Immediate effect. No explanation. She read it twice. The words were neutral, professional, impossible to argue with. Still, her stomach tightened. Sudden changes always carried risk. Around her, chairs shifted. People murmured. Someone joked half-heartedly about changes coming. Another person shrugged and said it was probably nothing. She stayed quiet. Silence gave her time to observe. The same presence from the day before entered again, just as calmly. This time people were prepared. They stood straighter. Conversation stopped completely. The difference was clear now. This was not a visitor. This was authority. The person spoke to the group as a whole. The voice remained steady and polite, almost friendly. There was talk of improvement, efficiency, accountability. Words that sounded safe on the surface. No threats. No raised voices. Just expectations laid out clearly. Like boundaries drawn with invisible ink. She listened carefully, noting what was said and what was not. There were no questions invited. No room for discussion. Only agreement. As the meeting ended, eyes drifted back to screens. Shoulders relaxed slightly, but the room did not return to its old rhythm. Something had shifted permanently. For the rest of the morning, her workload increased. Not dramatically, but steadily. Extra tasks placed quietly into her queue. She completed them without complaint. She always had. Efficiency was the one praise she allowed herself to earn. At lunchtime, she usually ate alone. That day was no different, though she noticed more people choosing to do the same. The break room felt subdued. No one lingered. People checked their phones more than their food. She considered calling someone she trusted just to hear a familiar voice. But she didn't. There was nothing concrete to explain. Saying something feels wrong had never gone well for her. In the afternoon, her supervisor, a person who usually avoided eye contact, stopped by her desk. The tone was polite, cautious. Compliments were sprinkled into the conversation. Then came the request. Could she assist with a new responsibility? It would be temporary. Her reliability had been noted. She nodded. Saying no would have required confidence she didn't feel. Saying yes felt safer. It always had. The new task required interaction with files she had never handled before. Restricted materials. Sensitive details. She worked carefully, double-checking every step. As she did, she became aware of how easily power could move through systems. Approvals happened quickly. Access was granted without resistance. The process trusted authority more than people. Once, as she stood by the printer, she felt someone behind her. She turned slightly and saw the same calm figure again, close enough now that the presence felt heavier. They spoke briefly, casually, commenting on the day's progress. The tone was friendly. The words carried no warmth. She responded politely, neutral, professional. The eyes studied her, not rudely, but thoroughly, as if adding her to a list she had never agreed to join. When the exchange ended, she realized her hands were shaking. She tucked them into her pockets until the feeling passed. Nothing inappropriate had been said. Nothing could be reported. That was what unsettled her the most. By the end of the day, she felt drained. Not physically, but mentally, as if she had spent hours holding a fragile object without dropping it. As she packed her bag, she noticed colleagues lingering longer than usual, reluctant to leave. Maybe they wanted safety in numbers. Maybe they were hoping the day would feel normal if they waited long enough. Outside, the light was fading. She walked home slower this time, lost in thought. Power hadn't threatened her. It hadn't raised its voice. It hadn't crossed a line. It had simply noticed her at home. She skipped dinner and made tea instead. She sat by the window, watching strangers pass below, each carrying their own unknown worries. The world looked unchanged, yet she felt separate from it. Like she had stepped slightly out of place. She replayed the moment by the printer, the way the conversation had ended without closure, the way authority never explained itself, because it didn't have to. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind connected dots she wished didn't exist. Extra responsibilities, increased access, attention she never sought. None of it was aggressive, but all of it pointed in the same direction. She wondered whether safety had ever truly existed, or if it had only lasted as long as no one powerful had reason to look her way, as she finally drifted into shallow sleep. One thought stayed with her, quiet but persistent. Power didn't need permission, and it had already stepped closer. The days that followed blended together, but not in a comforting way. Each morning began the same, yet felt heavier than the last. She still arrived early, still completed her tasks carefully, still kept her voice low. But now, every movement felt watched, measured, and remembered. She noticed how often her screen refreshed without her touching it, how approvals came through seconds after she submitted a request, how messages appeared in her inbox before she had time to ask questions. Systems that once felt neutral now felt alive, responding to authority faster than thought. At first, she blamed stress. Anyone would feel unsettled during sudden changes, she told herself. She had survived worse than this. Quiet pressure wasn't new to her. But this felt different. This pressure didn't push. It waited. Her new responsibilities grew each day. Nothing extreme, nothing that could be refused outright. Just enough to stretch her focus thin. Just enough to make her necessary. When someone becomes necessary, she knew they'd become visible. Coworkers began coming to her with questions. Some asked for help. Some asked for favors. Some asked simply to understand what was happening. She answered politely, but carefully. Every word felt like it could travel farther than intended. She noticed changes in how people looked at her. Not with warmth or resentment, but curiosity. The quiet kind that forms when someone is placed slightly apart from the group. She hadn't asked for recognition. It had arrived anyway. Late one afternoon, a calendar notice appeared without warning. A closed-door meeting, mandatory, no agenda listed. Her chest tightened. Closed doors removed witnesses. That lesson had been etched into her long ago. She considered calling in sick. The idea crept into her mind and lingered. But absence would raise questions, and questions led to explanations. She had learned that refusing quietly often carried more risk than complying carefully. When the time came, she walked to the office mentioned in the notice. Each step echoed louder than it should have. The hallway was quiet, too quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Inside the room was neat and impersonal. A desk, 2 chairs. The same calm presence sat waiting. No rush. No surprise, she sat when invited. The conversation began pleasantly. Comments about her work quality, her attention to detail, her reliability. Praise landed lightly, almost kindly, but she felt no comfort in it. Praise, she knew, often came before expectation. Then the tone shifted just slightly. There was talk of trust, of discretion, of how not everyone was equipped to handle sensitive responsibilities. She listened, nodding where expected. Careful not to show hesitation. One sentence lingered longer than the rest. Some people look safe, the voice said calmly. But safety is really about usefulness. She didn't respond. There was no question to answer. The meeting ended without formal instruction, but the message was clear enough. She was being positioned, watched more closely now. Not threatened, but boxed in. Walking back to her desk, she felt hollow. The building no longer felt structured. It felt territorial. That evening, she stayed late, not because she was asked to, but because leaving felt worse. The office emptied slowly until only a few lights remained. When she finally packed her things, she realized she was holding her breath. Outside, night had settled fully. The streetlights blurred as she walked. For the first time in years, she wondered if going home was really safer than staying. At her apartment, she checked the lock twice, then a third time. She sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. Silence pressed in, uncomfortably. Her phone rested in her hand, screen dark, waiting. She thought about reaching out. But to whom? There were people who cared about her once. People she had slowly drifted away from to protect her peace. She had chosen solitude because it felt safe. Now it felt like isolation. Sleep came in pieces. She woke often, heart racing, certain she had missed something important. In the gray hours before morning, she understood something she had avoided for years. Safety wasn't a fixed place. It was a condition that could be reassigned. The next day, small rules changed again. Her access expanded. Her workload adjusted. Nothing was explained aloud. Authority didn't feel the need to justify itself anymore. She realized then that compliance had invited closeness. Silence had been mistaken for consent. By midday, she made a quiet decision. She began documenting everything. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Times, changes, messages, instructions given verbally instead of in writing. She saved copies discreetly. She categorized notes in neutral language. It wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. Her heart pounded as she did it. But for the first time in days, fear sharpened into focus. She didn't know yet what she would do with the information. She only knew that standing empty-handed was no longer an option. As the workday ended, A calm presence passed by her desk again. This time the eyes lingered longer. There was no smile, just recognition. She met the gaze briefly, then looked away. Her hands were steady now, for the first time since power had walked through the door. She felt something shift inside her, not confidence, clarity. She was no longer assuming safety, she was preparing for truth. The decision she made did not change the world right away. Nothing dramatic happened the next morning. No alarms sounded. No warnings appeared. That almost made it harder. Quiet can be deceptive when you're waiting for consequences. She continued her routine, but now it carried purpose. Each step, each task, each conversation felt intentional. She listened more closely than before, not only to words but to what was avoided. Instructions were still given casually, often in passing, rarely committed to writing. She followed them as requested, but her notes grew longer each day. She learned how power preferred convenience. When things went smoothly, attention drifted elsewhere. When questions arose, authority leaned on trust instead of clarity. She didn't challenge this directly. She worked within it. There were moments when fear nearly stopped her. Each time she saved a message or noted a time, she wondered if she had already gone too far. She imagined being called into another closed room. She imagined explanations she didn't have ready. But she reminded herself that fear had been guiding her for too long. At work, people started to notice her energy change. She was still quiet, but no longer shrinking. She spoke only when necessary, yet her words carried more certainty. Some coworkers seemed relieved by it. Others kept their distance. One afternoon, a colleague sat beside her during a break. The conversation began with safe topics, then drifted carefully. There was hesitation, then a question left hanging in the air. Had she noticed things changing too? She answered honestly, but gently. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She only acknowledged what could already be seen. The relief on the colleague's face said enough. That was when she realized she was not alone. Over the next week, more people began testing the same quiet honesty. Small exchanges in hallways, pauses after meetings, shared looks that didn't need words. She listened more than she spoke, learning how deeply the confusion ran. Still, pressure continued. Deadlines shortened. Expectations expanded. Responsibility was passed downward, while decisions moved upward. The pattern became difficult to ignore. One evening, long after most desks had emptied, she noticed something new on her screen. Access that had been quietly removed. A notification framed as routine maintenance. No explanation. No acknowledgement. Her heart raced. This was how boundaries were enforced. Not with confrontation, but subtraction. She documented the change and sat back, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Panic wouldn't help. She needed clarity. The next day, she requested a brief meeting with her supervisor. It was the first time she had ever initiated one. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed the message, satisfied with its neutral tone. Professional, respectful. The response came quickly. The meeting was short, polite, carefully vague. The supervisor praised her adaptability, then reminded her of structure, of how decisions flowed, of staying in one's lane. She nodded, thanked them, and left without argument. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer believed obedience guaranteed protection. Later that afternoon, the calm presence passed by again. This time it stopped. The conversation was brief. Friendly words, measured tone. There was an acknowledgement of her effort, followed by a suggestion. A reminder that opportunities came with expectations. She listened, said little, and agreed to nothing. For the first time, the silence felt heavy between them. That night, she didn't go straight home. She walked longer than usual, letting the city noise blur her thoughts. When she finally reached her apartment, she sat on the floor instead of the couch and opened her notes. She read them not as a participant, but as an outsider. Patterns emerged clearly now. The favoritism masked as trust. The pressure applied selectively. The lack of written accountability, it was not chaos. It was design. Understanding this did not bring comfort. It brought certainty. Over the next days, she changed how she moved. She asked for confirmations politely. She followed up verbal instructions with short summaries, copied appropriately. She kept her tone neutral, her language careful. Some requests disappeared after that. Others were rerouted. The system adjusted around her in subtle ways. She noticed a distance growing. Not from everyone, but from authority. The air felt cooler, less watchful. She didn't mistake this for safety. She knew better now. But it was space. One morning, she overheard raised voices behind a closed door. Not shouting, just tension. Names were mentioned. Processes questioned. When the door opened, faces looked tight, change had begun elsewhere. She stayed focused, steady, unremarkable. That was still her strength. She did not lead. She did not expose. She endured while preparing. Then came a message she had not expected. A notice about a review. An upcoming evaluation. Formal this time, scheduled. Her pulse quickened. But she did not panic. She was ready. That evening, she printed selected notes. Nothing excessive. Nothing emotional. Just facts, dates, patterns. Information that spoke without accusation. The night before the review, sleep came slowly. Her thoughts circled between fear and resolve. She was still the same person who avoided attention, who valued peace, but peace no longer meant silence. On the morning of the evaluation, she dressed simply and arrived early. She sat quietly, hands folded, waiting. When she was called in, the room felt smaller than before. More people, more faces, less certainty. She answered questions plainly. She stayed calm. When asked to explain her work, she did so clearly. When confusion arose, she offered documentation. The mood shifted. Questions slowed. Notes were taken. Authority adjusted. She did not smile. When it ended, no conclusions were announced. But the air felt different as she returned to her desk. Lighter, more balanced. That afternoon passed without incident. So did the next day. Access was restored quietly. Instructions became clearer. Power hadn't disappeared, but it had paused. And in that pause, she understood something important. Safety wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about standing calm when pressure expected collapse. She went home that night feeling tired, but steady for the first time in a long while. She believed the ending of this story would not be decided without her. The days after the review passed quietly, almost softly, as if the building itself was recovering from a long-held breath. There were no announcements, no explanations, and no public acknowledgement of what had happened. But things were different now, in ways that mattered. Instructions came in writing. Expectations were clearer. Meetings included more voices. Decisions once delivered without context now arrived with reasons attached. Authority still existed, but it no longer moved unchecked. It had edges now. She noticed the difference immediately. Her workload stabilized. Access remained consistent. The sudden shifts that once kept her alert slowly faded. People around her seemed more at ease, though no one spoke openly about why. They didn't need to. Stability speaks for itself. The calm presence did not disappear, but it no longer passed her desk as often. When it did, the glances were shorter, neutral, uninterested. She was no longer convenient. That realization stayed with her. For years, she had believed safety came from being small, quiet, and agreeable. But she was learning that those qualities didn't protect people. They made people easy to move. One afternoon, a coworker thanked her quietly. Just a simple comment during a break. Nothing heroic. Nothing dramatic. Still, the words landed deeply. She nodded, unsure how to respond, and returned to her desk, feeling lighter than she had in months. She didn't see herself as brave. She had acted out of necessity, not courage. But courage, she realized, often looks like quiet preparation rather than loud resistance. Outside of work, her life began to shift as well. She started taking longer walks again, not because she needed time to think, but because she no longer felt the need to rush home. She reconnected with a few people she had once trusted, carefully, honestly. Not everyone stayed. That was okay at home. The silence no longer felt like a shield or a trap. It became just space. There were moments when doubt returned. Late at night, she sometimes wondered if she had imagined the danger, if she had overreacted. But then, she remembered how pressure felt before clarity arrived. She remembered how easily her safety had thinned. She trusted her memory at work. Systems continued to improve, slowly but noticeably. Small policies changed. Oversight increased. Responsibility became shared, rather than distributed downward. None of it was credited to her. She didn't want it to be. She learned that influence did not require recognition. One morning, she ran into the calm presence near the elevator. The interaction was brief. Polite words were exchanged. Nothing lingered after. As the doors closed, she felt no spike of fear, no need to analyze the moment. It was over, not erased, not forgotten, but resolved. That afternoon, she sat at her desk and looked around the room. People worked steadily. Conversations flowed at a normal volume. Laughter returned in small waves. The space felt like a workplace again, not a territory. She understood then that safety was not the absence of power. Power would always exist somewhere. Safety was knowing where you stood and having the tools to hold your ground. Before leaving that day, she closed her private folder for the last time. She didn't delete it. She archived it. Preparedness no longer meant vigilance. It meant readiness. As she walked out into the evening light, she felt tired in a good way. Not drained. Not tense. Just human. Her life was still simple. Still quiet. But it was no longer built on avoidance. She thought back to the moment when the door had first opened, when power had entered without announcement and shifted everything. She remembered how small she had felt, how unsafe. That person did not change her life. Her response did. From then on, she carried a different understanding with her. Safety would never come from hiding or hoping not to be noticed. It came from awareness, boundaries, and the willingness to prepare without panic. She unlocked her door at home, stepped inside, and set her keys down without checking the lock twice. For the first time in a long while, she felt secure, not because power had left, but because she knew how to face it. Life did not change overnight after everything settled. There was no clear moment when she could say, "This is the day it all ended." Instead, change arrived slowly, in ordinary ways, the kind that only become visible when you stop and look back. Weeks passed, then months. The workplace found a steady rhythm again. Policies were followed more carefully. Communication stayed clearer. People felt less tense, less guarded. No one talked about the time when things had felt unstable. It became one of those quiet chapters people close without discussion. She remained where she was, doing the same work, arriving early, leaving on time. But something inside her had changed permanently. She no longer measured every step out of fear. She moved with intention. She noticed it first in small moments. When instructions were unclear, she asked simple questions without apology. When expectations stretched too far, she requested clarity instead of filling the gaps herself. Most of the time, the response was respectful. And when it wasn't, she now knew how to pause instead of panic. One afternoon, a new colleague joined the team. Nervous, polite, clearly trying not to take up space. She recognized that posture instantly. During a quiet moment, she offered help without hovering. Just enough guidance to steady someone else. The colleague smiled with relief. That smile stayed with her longer than she expected. She didn't see herself as a mentor. She didn't offer advice about power or systems. She simply showed, through calm and consistency, that safety could exist alongside awareness. Outside of work, her life continued to open gently. She accepted invitations she once declined automatically. She didn't force social connections, but she no longer avoided them either. Boundaries replaced walls. At home, she rearranged her space. Nothing dramatic. A chair moved closer to the window. The radio replaced by music she chose. The apartment felt less like shelter and more like home. There were still nights when memories surfaced unexpectedly. The moment the door had opened, the shift in air, the realization that safety could vanish quietly. When those thoughts came, she didn't fight them. She acknowledged them. Then she reminded herself how the story had continued. One day, during a routine meeting, she heard something that surprised her. A concern raised openly. A question asked without fear. Others joined in. Solutions were discussed respectfully. It happened without drama. She sat listening, hands folded, heart steady. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. Just recognition. Things worked better when people felt safe enough to speak. After the meeting, she stepped outside into the afternoon air. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that usually went unnoticed. She stood still for a moment longer than necessary. Letting the calm settle, she thought about how long she had lived believing safety was something fragile that had to be guarded constantly. How she had shrunk her life around that. Belief she understood now that safety was not something you outran or hid from. It was something you built. Gradually, through awareness and self-respect. Late one evening, she came across her old notes while organizing her files at home. She read through them once more, slowly. The early entries felt distant now, written by someone still, bracing for impact. She closed the folder carefully. Not because she was forgetting, but because she remembered. Enough the world was still unpredictable. Power still existed. People still made choices that affected others. None of that had changed. What had changed was her. Relationship with it, she no longer mistook. Silence for safety. She no longer believed strength had to be. Loud, she had learned that attention was not always danger, and invisibility was not always protection. On a quiet morning, as she prepared to leave for work, she paused at the doorway. She didn't check the lock twice. She didn't scan the hallway. She simply stepped forward. Life continued. Not perfectly, but honestly, and that was enough. Time kept moving. The way it always does, quietly, and without asking what anyone was ready for. She moved with it now, not ahead of it, and not afraid to fall behind. Life had found a softer pace, and she allowed herself to breathe inside it at work. She was no longer the quiet figure who blended into the background. She hadn't become loud or bold. She was simply present. When she spoke, people listened not because she demanded attention, but because her words were grounded. She chose them carefully, and that gave them weight. New processes continued to settle. Small mistakes were handled openly instead of hidden. Questions were asked without fear of consequence. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And better, she had learned, was worth protecting. One afternoon, a minor issue surfaced in a project she had been assigned. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. In the past, she would have carried the burden silently, fixing it alone to avoid scrutiny. This time, she shared the concern early. The response was calm. Solutions were discussed. No one blamed her. That moment stayed with her long after the task was resolved. It reminded her how much energy she had once spent preparing for reactions that never came. Later that week, during a routine check-in, she was asked how things felt now. The question was casual, genuine. She paused before answering. "They feel clear," she said finally. The word surprised her. Clear meant visible. It meant understanding what was expected and what was not. It meant fewer shadows where worry could grow. That evening, she took a longer route home. The city around her buzzed as usual. People hurried, laughed, argued, dreamed. She blended into the movement without trying to disappear. She thought about safety again, the way she often did when the world slowed just enough for reflection. Safety was no longer something she chased or guarded obsessively. It had become part of how she moved through space. Not perfect, but steady at home. She cooked a proper meal for the first time in a while. Nothing fancy. Just something warm, prepared without distraction. She ate slowly, the radio playing softly in the background. Later, she sat near the window, watching the lights outside flicker on one by one. For years, evenings had been the hardest part of her day. Too much time to think. Too much silence. Now, the quiet felt earned. A message came through on her phone from someone she hadn't heard from in a long time. An old friend, reaching out cautiously. She read it twice before responding. Her reply was simple. Honest. She did not explain everything. She didn't have to. The exchange ended with plans to meet soon, casually without pressure. She set the phone down and smiled to herself, surprised at how natural it felt. Not every door needed to stay closed forever. The next morning, she arrived at work to find a small note on her desk. A thank you for help she had offered weeks earlier and forgotten about. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She held the note for a moment longer than necessary, then tucked it away. Recognition no longer made her uncomfortable. It simply reminded her that presence mattered. During the afternoon, she was asked to assist on a new internal initiative. Nothing involving authority or oversight. Just guidance. Support she agreed without hesitation, as she spoke with the team later. She caught herself doing something she hadn't planned. She encouraged someone else to speak. The idea was simple, but the impact was immediate. The room shifted slightly. It's the way it always did when people felt included. She noticed it because she remembered how the opposite had once felt. That night, as she prepared for bed, she paused in front of the mirror. She looked the same. Same face, same posture. Same quiet presence, but the person looking back at her felt different. Not hardened, not guarded, just grounded. She thought back to the old version of herself, the one who believed safety meant staying unseen. She felt compassion for that woman now, not frustration. She had done the best she could with what she knew then. Before sleep, she wrote a few lines in a notebook she had started, keeping not observations, not documentation, just thoughts. She wrote about balance, about paying attention without fear, about how strength didn't always arrive in moments of pressure, but often showed up later. In small decisions that added up over time, she closed the notebook and turned off the light as she drifted towards sleep. One quiet truth settled in her chest. She was no longer defined by the moment. Power walked through the door. She was defined by everything that came after, and that, she realized, was where real safety lived. Life has a way of testing what we think we have already learned. Not with sudden shocks, but with small moments that ask quiet questions. She noticed this as another season came in. Gently shifting the light in her apartment and the air outside, work continued steadily. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt heavy. Yet she stayed aware, not tense, just present. Awareness had become a habit now, like breathing without thinking about it. One morning, a situation came up that would have rattled her before. A misunderstanding between two teams. Confusion over responsibility. Voices rose slightly, not in anger, but frustration. The room stiffened, the way rooms often do. When no one wants to be the first to speak, she felt the familiar tug inside her chest. The old instinct to stay quiet, to wait it out. To hope it would resolve without her presence. She paused. Then she spoke. Not loudly and not at length. Just enough to reframe the issue. She asked a simple question that hadn't been considered yet. The room shifted. The tension loosened. People looked down at their notes, then back up again. The issue didn't disappear instantly, but it moved forward. Afterwards, someone thanked her softly. She nodded and returned to her work without replaying the moment in her mind. That was new. She didn't carry it with her. Later that day, during a quiet moment, she realized she no longer kept a running list of risks in her head. She didn't scan every interaction for hidden meaning. She trusted herself to respond if something arose. That trust felt like freedom. Outside of work, her days felt fuller in small ways. She met her old friend for coffee, the conversation starting cautiously, then warming naturally. They talked about ordinary things. Work, weather, plans that didn't feel heavy or demanding. At one point, the friend asked how she was doing. Really? She thought for a moment. I'm steady, she said. The word felt true. Walking home afterward, she reflected on how long she had mistaken steadiness for boredom. In truth, it was peace without numbness, a balance she hadn't known before. At home, she sorted through belongings she had ignored for years. Old papers, old notes, things she kept because letting go once felt risky. She moved slowly, deciding what still served her and what did not. Some things were thrown away. Some were filed. Some were released without ceremony. The process felt grounding, like clearing space, not just in her apartment, but inside herself. That night, she dreamed differently. Not in stolen fragments or sudden jolts, just long drifting rest when morning came. She woke without tension in her shoulders. Weeks later, a new change was announced at work. A leadership adjustment, transparency measures, clear channels for feedback. The changes were framed professionally as progress and growth. She listened. Calm, she didn't feel a rush of emotion. She didn't feel the need to measure what it meant for her. She knew now that her sense of safety no longer depended on perfect conditions. After the meeting, she stepped outside for fresh air. The day was bright but soft, the kind that didn't demand attention. She stood still, hands in her pockets. Aware of how unnecessary it felt to brace herself, she thought again of that first moment. Long ago, when the door had opened and the room had shifted, that moment had once defined everything for her. Now it felt like a reference point, a beginning. Not a shadow. She had learned that power does not always look cruel or loud. Sometimes it simply enters and assumes space. And she had learned something even more important. She no longer handed her safety over to it at work. She continued to support others quietly, encouraging clarity, asking questions that opened space rather than closing it. She didn't model fear or defiance. She modeled balance. One afternoon, a newer colleague stopped by her desk. Nervous energy. Careful words. "Can I ask you something?" the voice said. She nodded. The question was simple but carried weight. "How do you know when to speak up?" She considered the answer carefully. "When something asks you to shrink," she said, "that's usually the moment." The colleague smiled, relieved. As the day ended, she packed her bag and left on time. Outside, the evening carried the sound of life continuing around her. Cars passed. People talked. Somewhere music played. She walked without rushing. At home, she opened a window and let the air move through the room. She didn't reach for the radio. She enjoyed the quiet as it was, before bed. She wrote again in her notebook this time. She didn't write about lessons or observations. She wrote about gratitude, not gratitude for comfort or ease, but for growth that arrived without breaking her. She closed the notebook and rested both hands on it for a moment, breathing evenly as sleep settled in. One final understanding came clearly. Safety was never something she lost. It was something she hadn't known how to carry. Now she did, and she carried it with her. Not as armor, but as calm confidence, wherever she went.